In previous episodes of Russian Untouchables, we showed you how Russian police officers and tax officials helped steal $230 million from the Russian government, and how Sergei Magnitsky exposed them and ended up dead. Today, we're going to show you who murdered Sergei Magnitsky. Most of the information in this movie was gathered by Sergei Magnitsky himself shortly before his files were taken, and he was arrested by the same officers he testified against.
Sergei Magnitsky traced the $230 million tax theft to an organized crime group headed by a 44-year-old convicted criminal, Dmitry Kluyev. In 2008, Sergei Magnitsky decided to document the group's crimes and expose it. He didn't realize that he was about to expose the crimes of the Russian government itself. Sergei Magnitsky learned that 13 years ago, Dmitry Kluyev, the head of the organized crime group, was just a petty criminal. He first shows up in police records on the 3rd of June, 1998, when he was arrested after beating a man he caught leaving the apartment of his girlfriend. Within 5 years, Kluyev had become an important organized crime figure. On March 16, 2003, just as he and his wife were leaving the Starlight Diner in Moscow, a professional assassin waiting in the car park tried to kill them with a 6.35mm pistol. Kluyev's bodyguard was shot in the stomach and was seriously injured, but Kluyev and his wife escaped unharmed.
However, it was Kluyev's financial schemes that most interested Sergei Magnitsky. He found court documents showing that in 2002, the president of the Moscow investment bank Renaissance Capital, Igor Sagirian, brought in Kluyev to obtain a massive tax refund. This information came from the testimony of another Renaissance Capital executive, Yuri Saigodak, former general of the KGB. The modus operandi described in the documents was exactly the same as used 5 years later to steal $230 million of taxes paid by the Hermitage Fund.
Sergei Magnitsky then discovered a crime which, combined with newly discovered travel records, proves the collaboration between Interior Ministry officers and organized criminals. In December of 2004, Dmitry Kluyev and his lawyer Andrei Pavlov attempted to steal $1.6 billion worth of shares in the iron ore company Mikhailovsky Gok.
A criminal case was launched against the Kluyev crime group. The investigation into the crime was headed by Interior Ministry officer Major Pavel Karpov. Karpov questioned many witnesses, all of whom identified Kluyev as the mastermind. However, in an unusual development in a criminal case, 4 months before the final verdict, Major Pavel Karpov, the main investigator, and Dmitry Kluyev, the main suspect, went on vacation together. Records from the Russian Border Control Service show that on the 5th of April 2006, they flew together to Larnaca, Cyprus, where they spent 3 days on vacation.
After returning from Cyprus, instead of Major Karpov indicting Kluyev as the mastermind of the fraud, he named Sergei Albayev, Kluyev's driver, as the person mostly responsible for this complex $1.6 billion fraud. But Albayev couldn't challenge this conclusion because he was found dead in the Rostov region, about 1,000 kilometers south of Moscow. According to the official autopsy, he died of heart failure.
Karpov also named another low-level member of the Kluyev crime group, Alexei Alexanov, as another key player in the crime. But again, before Alexanov had the opportunity to defend himself, he also mysteriously died of heart failure before the trial. Karpov never indicted Kluyev's partner, attorney Andrei Pavlov, who prepared all the fraudulent documents. And most importantly, Major Karpov fixed the investigation results so Kluyev could avoid prison. Kluyev was only given a suspended sentence thanks to Major Karpov's work. With Major Karpov now a key member, the Kluyev group became bolder. Using law enforcement to blame innocent or dead people for crimes became the group's modus operandi, and it expanded its operations to include extortion and kidnapping.
On August 16th of 2006, Major Pavel Karpov and Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Kuznetsov arranged the arrest of Fyodor Mikheyev, a Moscow fertilizer executive. Initially, they held him at Petrovka 38, Moscow police headquarters. Then, according to court testimony, Kluyev asked his main enforcer, Sergei Orlov, to physically take Mr. Mikheyev from the officers and drive him 48 kilometers outside of Moscow to a country house. At the country house, Mr. Mikheyev was held hostage by a convicted killer, Viktor Markelov.
While Markelov and Orlov held him, they demanded a $20 million ransom from Mr. Mikheyev's boss. Mr. Mikheyev testified,
Sergei Orlov and Viktor Markelov periodically reminded me that in case I tried to escape, not only would I suffer, but my relatives and family as well.
Ekaterina, Mr. Mikheyev's wife, testified that the kidnappers threatened to gang rape her if she went to the authorities for help.
Would you like it if you were taken into a country house with many drunken men who would then rape you in a circle?
Despite these ominous threats, Mrs. Mikheyev appealed to a different branch of the police. And on August 28th of 2006, a dozen heavily armed troops from the Federal Anti-Kidnapping Task Force stormed the house at about 3 p.m. They freed Mr. Mikheyev, they arrested Orlov and Markelov, and they opened a criminal case against officers Kuznetsov and Karpov, and they began to question Kluyev.
Once again, corrupt Interior Ministry officers fixed their problem. The investigation of Karpov and Kuznetsov and the questioning of Kluyev was dropped. Orlov and Markelov were freed, and Mr. Mikheyev was re-arrested and sent to prison for 11 years, where he sits to this day. Sergei Magnitsky's most important discovery, and the one that cost him his life, was uncovering the Ren gas tax fraud. 6 months after the Mikheyev kidnapping, Kluyev and Pavlov organized the theft of $107 million of taxes paid by Rengas, affiliates of Renaissance Capital, one of the largest and most important investment banks in Russia. This was the same company whose president, Igor Sagirian, brought in Kluyev in 2002 to arrange tax refunds through the court system. Kluyev's attorney, Pavlov, working together with the heads of Moscow tax offices 28 and 25, organized a fraudulent tax refund of $107 million, paid by the two Renaissance Capital affiliates. The money was wired to accounts in the Universal Savings Bank, which was proven in court to be owned and controlled by Dmitry Kluyev. Shortly after receiving the fraudulent tax refund, Kluyev, who owned the bank that received the stolen $107 million, along with Olga Stepanova, head of Tax Office 28, who refunded the money, and Stepanova's husband, Vladlen, went on vacation to Dubai. They then traveled to Switzerland, where the Stepanovs held secret accounts with Credit Suisse. And on the 16th of January, Kluyev and the Stepanovs flew from Geneva to Moscow together on the same flight. Meanwhile, Interior Ministry officer Karpov, together with Kluyev's lawyers, Pavlov and his wife, who prepared all the court documents for the illegal tax refund, flew to London on the same flight and spent 5 days enjoying the sights and shopping for New Year's gifts. In Pavlov's wife's visa application, she confirmed to the UK Border Service that she and her husband Pavlov were traveling together with Major Karpov of the Interior Ministry.
After the return from their respective vacations, the Kluyev criminal group planned its next and largest crime, the theft of taxes paid by Hermitage Fund, the largest investment firm in Russia.
To plan this, the Kluyev group invited all the key players to meetings in Cyprus. According to the manifest of Kluyev's private jet, on April the 28th, 2007, Kluyev, along with Interior Ministry officer Artem Kuznetsov, flew to Larnaca on Kluyev's private jet. Two days later, Interior Ministry officer Karpov flew together with Kluyev's deputy Pavlov and his wife on Aeroflot 487 to Larnaca. Finally, the head of Tax Office 28 and her husband flew on Aeroflot 237 to Larnaca. At the Cyprus meeting, Kluyev assigned the tasks that each member of the group would play in what would become the largest tax refund fraud in Russian history.
1 month later, early in the morning of June 4th, 2007, Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Kuznetsov led a team of 25 officers and raided the offices of Hermitage Fund and its lawyers. He took the documents for the Hermitage Fund companies and their seals, and he handed these to Major Pavel Karpov.
The documents were then used to fraudulently re-register 3 Hermitage companies into the name of Viktor Markelov, the same man who had kidnapped Fyodor Mikheyev with the same police officers 13 months earlier. Once again, they moved the companies to Tax Office 28, run by Olga Stepanova, and opened accounts for the companies at Kluyev's Universal Savings Bank. While this was going on, Kluyev's lawyer Pavlov did exactly the same thing as he had in the Rengas fraud a year earlier. The same lawyer used the same courts and the same plaintiffs and the same forged documents word for word in order to obtain judgments for huge debts that did not exist.
On the 24th of December, the Kluyev Group submitted a fraudulent tax refund request to Olga Stepanova and her colleagues for $230 million, the largest fraudulent tax refund in Russian history. It was granted on the same day with no questions asked, and once again it was paid directly to accounts at Kluyev's Universal Savings Bank.
Once again, the criminals and police officers celebrated by going on vacation together. On New Year's Day 2008, right after the $230 million had been wired to Kluyev's bank, Major Karpov and attorneys Pavlov and his wife flew to Istanbul and returned to Moscow together 4 days later. Shortly after, attorneys Pavlov and his wife flew to Dubai to join tax officer Stepanova, her husband, and Kluyev. 1 week later, the tax officers began spending their share of the stolen government money on Dubai properties. Credit Suisse bank statements show that Vladlen Stepanov, husband of Olga Stepanova, who approved the refund along with 2 of Stepanova's subordinates from Tax Office 28, made 4 down payments from the same Swiss bank account to purchase $8 million of properties at the Kempinski Hotel and Residences, Palm Jumeirah in Dubai.
In October of 2008, Sergei Magnitsky gave an interview to the Moscow bureau chief of Business Week magazine. He showed that all the tax thefts had been committed by the same people, and that the Kluyev criminal group had been systematically stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the Russian government for years. He then testified against all the police officers involved.
After the Business Week story was published, tax officer Stepanova and her husband panicked and fled Russia to Dubai. Shortly thereafter, on November the 20th, Igor Sagirian, the president of Renaissance Capital, who brought in Kluyev to do tax refunds for Renaissance, also flew to Dubai. He was accompanied by Vladimir Jabarov, another Renaissance manager, formerly a lieutenant general of the FSB, the Russian secret police. 3 days later, the Stepanovs apparently believed that an effective cover-up plan was in place, and they returned to Moscow with Sagirian on the same flight. They crossed passport control one after another. The very next day, Officer Kuznetsov sent his subordinates to arrest Sergei Magnitsky and confiscate the Magnitsky files. Once Sergei Magnitsky was in custody, they started to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. The criminals then began protecting the key members of the group. At first, the Interior Ministry blamed the entire sophisticated tax fraud on Viktor Markelov, the convicted murderer and former sawmill foreman. When the media didn't buy this story, they blamed another low-level ex-con who had participated in the crime, Valery Korochkin. But he couldn't be questioned about the organizers because in 2008 he was found dead in Borispol, Ukraine. He was 43 years old. Then, they named a 53-year-old security guard, Oktay Gasanov, as the mastermind of the crime. This story also backfired for the Kluyev Group because Gasanov had died 2 months before the money was stolen from the government. At this point, the press began reporting that Kluyev was the organizer behind the theft and that he owned Universal Savings Bank, which received all the stolen money. The Interior Ministry then announced that just before the stolen money was transferred to the bank, Kluyev sold the bank to a 55-year-old clothing salesman, Mr. Semyon Korobenikov. Mr. Korobenikov could also not be questioned because he died falling off a balcony in 2008. The Interior Ministry then exonerated all the tax officials, concluding that they were innocent and tricked into making the refunds. This was despite the fact that the tax officials had acquired $43 million at the time of the refund and were vacationing with the man who owned the bank that received all the money. Then the Interior Ministry announced the stolen money could not be traced because the truck carrying all the records of Universal Savings Bank exploded in central Moscow.
The one problem that the Interior Ministry had was that Sergei Magnitsky would not be silenced. On October 14th of 2009, from pretrial detention, Sergei Magnitsky again testified against the Kluyev criminal group.
4 weeks later, on November the 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky was found dead on the floor of an isolation cell. He had been handcuffed and beaten to death by 8 riot guards with rubber batons, the handcuffs lacerating his wrists as he struggled to survive. The official cause of death, heart failure, with no signs of violence. 1 year after they murdered Sergei Magnitsky for exposing their crimes, the Interior Ministry blamed him for the same $230 million theft that he tried to prevent. In the spring of 2012, the independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta, along with the Financial Times, revealed that after the arrest and murder of Sergei Magnitsky, the Kluyev criminal group received an additional $400 million in fraudulent refunds, authorized by the same Tax Office 28 and laundered through a new bank registered at the same address as the Universal Savings Bank. This one criminal group has stolen $800 million from the Russian people, and everybody at the highest levels of the Russian government knows which officials are involved. When Sergei Magnitsky decided to expose the Kluyev criminal group, he believed that he'd found a pocket of corruption inside the Russian government. He never could have imagined that organized crime had become so intertwined with the Russian government that there was no longer any difference between the two. It's time to stop the Untouchables. Russia deserves better.